Thank you for praying for me this past week. I preached all week in Mississippi at Camp Morganwood, Free Baptist Youth Camp in Mississippi, to about 65 teenagers, and I had just a great week, and teenagers responded well to the messages, and God worked on people's hearts, and so thankful for that. Everything went great until it came time for me to come home, and I did a thing that I often do. I left a bunch of my stuff behind, and I had a whole bunch of shirts hanging up in the closet, and they're still there in Mississippi, hanging in that closet. So that's kind of how my mind operates. I am everywhere and all at once, and as soon as we were done there, I was still thinking about some kids that had made some decisions and thinking about this Sunday. And man, this is a special Sunday for our church, and my heart is overflowing. I'm worn out from being at camp all week and preaching multiple times each day to those teenagers, but I couldn't sleep last night. Just excited to be with you and worship today. And when I'm in a situation like I was this past week at camp, I see a lot of people that maybe I haven't seen in a long time, or talk to people I've never met before. And one of the first questions they'll ask you is, "How long have you been pastoring there at Faith Church in Chandler?" And so I told many people, well, it's 12 years, going to be 13, and on Labor Day. And just thinking about that several times through the week, just so thankful for all that God has done to bring us to this place. The passage of Scripture I'm going to talk to you about today is actually one that I preached on this message, not this message, but this passage, this occasion where Matthew invites a bunch of people over to his house. I preached that Friend Day of 2006. And if you were here Friend Day of 2006, some of you might remember that as the Sunday that I swallowed a goldfish. I told our kids and everyone that if we got over 100 people to church on that Sunday, that I would swallow a goldfish. And I said it because it seemed almost impossible that we could have that many people here at church. And we met that goal, and so I had to put my money where my mouth was and swallow the goldfish. And that was an incredible moment that we had managed to get that many people here to church. We had sent out the van and filled it up with kids, probably more kids than could fit in the van legally. And today, it is a regular occurrence for us to have more than that. And to look back over the last many years to see all that God has done, and to think that we're at a place where today we're going to collect offering to purchase property across the street, to add more parking, to make more room for people to come and be a part of our church, to establish ministry to people that we've been passionate for and reaching out to for many years. I am so thankful for all that God has done, and I'm thankful to you for your faithfulness and your willingness to serve and give and invite, and I'm so thankful this morning. And so that's kind of where my heart's at when I preach to you today, and I hope that the message is a blessing. It kind of just gives us the right perspective as we set out on this endeavor and make this commitment today. It was the fall of last year. Brandy gave me a copy of a book on prayer, and I began praying circles around some really big prayer requests. And today we're given towards an answer that God has given us to those prayers, and I'm thankful. I'm thankful that for our church, this has been our passion from the very beginning. It has always been our passion to reach our community. That's the reason that Bob Helm started this church in the late 70s, early 80s. It was his passion to reach this community for Christ, to make a place, to build a church where people could come to know Christ. Their life could move from brokenness to restoration. And that's always been the heart of everything that we have done here. That was the heart behind the original core group that built this church and it established its ministry and discipled those that are here with us now. And it's the heartbeat of this new core group that's building the church that our children will lead one day. We have always been passionate about introducing people to Jesus. That's what we have always been about. And as we embark on this new ministry effort this morning, that's what this is about still. Our heartbeat hasn't changed. This will be a new method and a new means of ministry, but the mission and our heartbeat and our passion for it has never changed. This is just another expression of that passion that we have. I want you to look at this passage of Scripture with me, because I want you to see that what we're doing today is not anything novel or new, but it's something that God has been about for a long period of time. I want you to look with me today at the original Matt's house in Luke chapter 5 and verse 27. After these things, he went forth and saw a publican. Now, a publican was a tax collector, someone who collected taxes from the Jews for the Romans, because the Romans had come in and conquered the Jews, and they employed Jewish people to extract taxes from the Jews to fill their coffers, to fund their armies, to fund their wars. And so he sees one of these tax collectors named Levi. Levi is also known by another name, Matthew. So Matthew is a tax collector who is sitting at his table where he collects his funds, and Jesus sees him sitting at the receipt of custom, and he said unto him, "Follow me." Jesus invites Matthew to follow him. And we believe that for anyone who's going to move from brokenness to restoration, step one is to follow Jesus. And so Jesus says to Matthew, "Follow me." And verse 28 is amazing. Verse 28 says, "And he left all, rose up, and followed him." A lot happened in that moment. When Matthew stood up and left behind his place of business, his place of employment, and said, "I'm leaving all of this behind to follow Jesus." Verse 29 tells us what Levi or Matthew does next. "And Levi made him a great feast in his own house, and there was a great company of publicans and others that sat down with them. But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, Why do you eat and drink with publicans and sinners? And Jesus answering said unto them, They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." There wasn't enough room in a house that Jesus was teaching at a few verses back. We read earlier in Luke's gospel about Jesus is teaching in a house, and it is full of lawyers and Pharisees, and this group brings their friend to Jesus who needs to be healed because he's lame, and they can't get in the house because it's so full of these religious people. So they actually end up lifting up the tiles of the ceiling so they can lower their friend down to see Jesus. Just a few verses up, that's taking place. Jesus finds himself in another house, and there's plenty of room for sinners because that's all that's in the house. It's a house full of sinners. That's what our church is to be, a house full of sinners. God makes us saints, and He changes our lives. He moves us from brokenness to restoration, but it's all Him. We are all still just sinners saved by grace. And when we are a house full of sinners, we'll be moved to constantly make room for more sinners. It was the house full of religious people that no room could be made for the man who was lame and needed to get to Jesus. But in the house full of sinners, there was plenty of room for all the sinners to get where Jesus was. And Jesus makes it very clear here that the mission, the reason that He came, was to call the sinners to repentance. He said, those that are whole don't need a physician, but those that are sick. He said, that's what I'm about. I want there to be so many sinners in our church that religious people find it uncomfortable. Let me repeat that, because I mean it wholeheartedly. I want there to be so many sinners in our church that religious people find it uncomfortable. And I think that's what we have. Because sometimes there are religious people that come to our church and they're not happy with the last church that they left, and they were there for 6 months and they couldn't get it straightened out or couldn't get them to be what they want them to be, so they come to our church. And they come here and they want us to become a religious place like they are, and that's not who we are. We're a place for broken people and sick people, and they feel uncomfortable here. And that's where I think Jesus would be most comfortable, is in a house full of sinners. Jesus sat down with these publicans and sinners. I've been recently listening to a bunch of seminars by this pastor in Alabama whose church has done some incredible things to reach their community. And similar to what we've done, there was a Sunday that they gave T-shirts out to everyone at church that day. And it was a couple months later That's one of the people that were at church that day got arrested, and so their mugshot appeared in the paper, and there's the name of their church on his t-shirt. And so a couple weeks later, the pastor blurs the guy's face out, but puts his picture up on the screen and says, "This is the kind of church we are. We're a church that broken people attend, and that means that sometimes our t-shirts are going to end up in a mugshot." That's the kind of church that we are. We are a church that ministers to the broken in our community. We are a church that attracts those that need Jesus. And so when we talk about building a church that our friends and neighbors will attend, we're talking about one where our friends and neighbors can come and meet with Jesus. They can come and they can be changed by His power, His grace. Jesus calls Matthew to follow Him. He goes to where Matthew's at and he says, "Follow me." And Jesus is initiating this friendship. Jesus is always calling sinners. That's what He does. He's always calling sinners to Himself. It tells us here after these things, He goes and He calls Matthew to follow Him. He's been calling His disciples throughout this whole passage, and everywhere Jesus goes, He's calling sinners to follow Him. He's never changed. That's what He's always been about. Jesus is forever initiating relationships with sinners. When I was 12, we lived in Nashville, Tennessee. Delta Airlines reorganized, so my father had to be transferred from Nashville to Norfolk. I went from being in this neighborhood where we had the biggest yard and everybody in the neighborhood, on the street, would come and play at our yard. I had all of these friends. And I moved to a new place and I didn't know anyone. Didn't have any friends there. I was going to a new school in the fall. And that summer, the church that we were attending, the youth group, was going to a minor league baseball game. And my parents were like, "You should really go to that." And I was like, "I don't want to go," because I didn't know anybody. They convinced me to get out of the house. They were tired of just letting me sit on the couch, look out the window, and feel sad for myself like a 12-year-old, about to be 13-year-old, could do when they didn't have any friends. This was before phones. This was before Facebook. If I wanted to stay in contact with my old friends, I had to write them a letter. So I go to this baseball game, and people are just kind of standing around waiting to get on the van. And this guy comes over to me, and he says, "Hey, my name's Justin. What's your name?" And that guy is still my friend today. He serves as a youth pastor in Virginia. We stayed close throughout high school, through college. He's still my friend today. He initiated that friendship. Man, that meant the world to me. He came over, he walked across the room, he stuck out his hand, and he introduced himself. Can I tell you, that's what Jesus does. Jesus is always introducing Himself to people. Now, maybe that they don't listen to Him, maybe that they don't respond, that they don't welcome His friendship, but Jesus is forever initiating relationships with people like He did with Matthew in this passage. And this is incredible that Jesus does this because of who Matthew is. Matthew is a publican, which means he's a tax collector for the occupying force. He's as popular as an IRS agent who's called to do an audit, mixed with a terrorist because he works for the other team. He's incredibly unpopular with the common people. The publicans were not well liked. They were known to be thieves who skim money off of the top. If you had to pay $2, they would charge you $3, keep $1 for themselves, and give $2 to the Romans. They were well funded. They were rich. They had plenty of money, but they weren't well liked, and so they were well connected in their own circles because they weren't popular in the common people. Among the common people, they were well connected to one another. Because of their sin, because of their lifestyle, they didn't have a whole lot of friends, but those that they were friends with in their same sinful lifestyle, they were tight with. Can I just tell you that what I have seen again and again is that when we can break into a network of sinners because one of them gets saved, it is a powerful thing. Some of you here today, you have invited so many friends to come and meet Jesus. You've invited so many friends to come to church because you were in a network of broken people, and as Jesus has saved you, you have given us an opportunity to introduce all of those friends to Jesus. It was an incredible moment when Jesus says to Matthew, a publican, "Follow me." And it's amazing that Matthew leaves everything and follows Him. What was Matthew doing when Jesus called him? He was working at his place of employment, and he gets up from all of it and follows Jesus. You know what he was saying in that moment? this is more important than the rest of it. This is more important than anything else. I am walking away from my job in this moment so that I can follow Jesus. Now, you don't need to quit your job to follow Jesus, okay? But Jesus ought to be your number one priority. He ought to be number one in our lives. Right? I mean, you guys are kind of looking at me like, oh, yes, most definitely. We're going to follow Jesus. He's leading in our lives. But you know what I see a lot of today? Jesus is one of our many priorities. Maybe He's not even first tier. You know what I'm afraid we're teaching our kids? The church is something we do if we don't have anything else going on. I'm afraid that we're teaching our kids that Jesus is important as long as we don't have these other things happening. That if there are no other things to do that day, then we will follow Jesus, then we will worship Jesus, then we will serve Jesus. Matthew walks away from all of it. He says, I'm going to follow you, Jesus. That is the number one thing. And Matthew, being this broken, corrupt, irreligious thief, gets that this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Do we know that this morning? It is the opportunity of a lifetime, of eternity, to follow Jesus. The opportunity that we have to get up this morning and serve Jesus and make a difference in somebody's life, that is incredible. That should be a priority to us. That should matter to us. That should get us out of bed in the morning. That should make us excited that we have this opportunity, that we have this chance, that we get to be a part of this. It should matter to us. Matthew left everything to follow Jesus. You know what he knew? Nearly nothing. He wasn't a religious scholar. He wasn't like the Pharisees. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a leader. He knew more about the Roman tax system than he did about Jesus or prophecy or Scripture, but he recognized this one thing: this is my shot. This is my opportunity to follow Jesus, and I'm not going to miss out on this. I'm not going to miss out on this chance. I'm afraid that many of us, we think that, well, I got a chance this Sunday, but I'll have another chance next Sunday. I'll have another chance next Sunday. Can I just tell you, friends, that over the past year, what I have learned is that we should take no chance and no day and no moment for granted. Jesus said, Matthew, you follow me. And Matthew left everything to follow him. Matthew was broken, and Matthew was busy, but he followed Jesus. And this word that he left everything, it means to lay it down. And some of you, if you're honest this morning, the reason that you're not following Jesus is there's something you just can't bring yourself to lay down. You can't let go of it. And I want you to think about that. I want you to get real clear with yourself and honest with yourself about that. Because if there's something that you're holding on to and you're struggling to lay it down so you can follow Jesus, I want you to recognize that what you're doing is you're choosing that over Jesus. You're choosing that over Him. Matthew laid it all down and followed Jesus. And then, verse 29 says that he threw a great feast in his own house. Matthew was so excited that he threw a party. He wanted everyone to know Jesus. So he invited all of his friends to a feast that he was going to serve. He was going to use that wealth that he had to be generous and welcome broken people into his house to make space for them so that they would have a place to meet Jesus. And friends, can I say that when we experience the grace of Jesus, we want other people to experience it too. When we are clear on what God has done for us, we want Him to do it for others too. Matthew was broken, but he introduced others to Jesus. And some of you think that you need to be all put back together before you can serve. No. Do you know how many people we'd have serving here if you had to be all put together before you could serve? No one. There'd be nobody to preach this morning because I'm not all put together. I'm messed up and I'm broken. And I'm standing before you preaching the gospel today while I'm broken because God works through broken people and He uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. That's what he does. So for that reason, there are people that are serving here at our church that their life is a mess. Starting right here on the stage. Because God uses broken people, and He doesn't want us to stay there. He wants to restore us, but God uses broken Matthew, been following Jesus all of 4 hours, to introduce others to Christ. And the people at the party, they were just like Matthew. Because Matthew was a publican, that's who he knew. That was the network he ran in. And so he invited other publicans. Not only does Jesus talk Matthew into following him, but he goes home to eat with him. And not only does he go to eat with him, he eats with all of his publican friends and his buddies. And Matthew places Jesus at the table with these sinners and these broken people. The Bible tells us that the publicans and sinners sat down to eat with Jesus, and this was scandalous. The Jews had strict laws about what they would and would not eat. They had strict laws about when you could harvest grain and when you couldn't, how it had to be prepared. And just as strict as their laws were about how you prepared food, they had laws about when and where and how and who with you ate the food. I mean, they would have made vegans look not strict. And Jesus is eating with these people, and the scribes and the Pharisees say, He's eating with publicans and sinners. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, that's the reason I'm here. Now, they call Jesus a friend of sinners. That's what they refer to him as. And Jesus wears that name with pride. He says, yeah, that's who I am. And that's the reason I'm here. I'm here to eat and meet sinners, spend time with them. Now, the righteous men of the day felt it was their job to keep everyone straight, to show them how bad they were. But Jesus, He spends time with them. And that's what Jesus does. He uses our brokenness for His glory. It was because Matthew was a publican and a sinner that he could invite other publicans and sinners to the feast that day to spend time with Jesus. Jesus says, I came to win the lost, not the found. I came to minister to the sick, not the healthy. Matthew, through this feast, he would later write a gospel about Jesus' works. And he would record these words of Jesus in chapter 7 and verse 23 of those who think that they know Jesus. He says, I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you work iniquity. People who are convinced that they are followers of Jesus because they're so righteous and they're so good. People that called Jesus Lord, Lord, but they had never given their life over to Him. Jesus will say, I never knew you. As Christians, we're called to be ambassadors, people who introduce others to Jesus. We've put our faith in Christ. We're a part of this kingdom, and we're to represent this kingdom to others. Because we recognize that there is no greater thing that they can receive than the kingdom of the Lord. Because it's made such a huge difference in our lives. Because we are experiencing it on a regular basis. Because the gospel has changed us. We know that it can change everything else. Because it's changed who we are. We know that it can change anyone else. And so we take this message to everyone. Because we know that with it, there are the untold riches of grace and mercy. Matthew didn't know much, but he knew that Jesus was a guy that these people needed to meet. That's what he knew. He knew that if they had Jesus, they'd have everything. I think about Matthew's friends. Matthew's friends are fellow tax collectors and publicans. I mean, think about the kind of person you would have to be a publican. I mean, you're a Jew, your family is Jewish, and Israel is overtaken by this occupying force of Rome. They come and they take over your country. And then they're looking for people who will collect taxes for them from their fellow neighbors and citizens. Imagine the kind of person who says, yes, I'll take taxes for the enemy from my friends and my family. It'd have to be somebody that was pretty greedy. Somebody be willing to turn their back on their friends, turn their back on their morals so that they could receive money. And Matthew says, listen, guys, what we've been looking for, what we've been searching for, it's here. We've been willing to do anything and everything that we possibly can to try to find the money, to get our hands on means, to be wealthy, to finally have a life that we've been longing for, looking for. And Matthew says, listen, guys, I was right there where you're at. I was a publican just like the rest of you. But I walked away from all of that when I met Jesus. You know what the publicans were? The publicans were people searching just like the rest of us. And they were searching for their sustenance in life. They were searching for what they desired in life through money. And maybe your search has led you down the path of sex, relationships, failed relationship after failed relationship, trying to find your worth, trying to find what feels right, trying to find happiness in this life. Maybe your path is taking you down the road of career and success. If you can just achieve, if you can have a place of authority and power. Maybe your path is taking you down the path of abuse, substance abuse, addiction. Matthew had gone down the path of money. And what he found is that in Jesus was everything that he needed. I don't have a whole lot to offer this morning. When I go to the jail and I preach to people, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a social worker. But I believe wholeheartedly that what I have to offer can change everything. What business does our church have engaging in a ministry like we hope to have at Matt's house, where we help people who are struggling with addiction to transition into a life that's been restored? What business do we have of wading into that kind of brokenness? What do we have to offer them? Just Jesus. That's what we got. And that's enough. Matthew invited his friends over, and he threw a feast because he knew, like Baptists know, that if you serve food, people will show up. But the real reason that he had the feast was Jesus. Matt's house will be a place of transitional housing, and it'll be supplying a physical need in shelter to those who have no place to go other than back with those who led them into addiction in the first place. It'll be providing that physical need, but what it really offers is Jesus. And if it's about anything other than that, it's vanity and we're wasting our time. Because if they have Jesus, they got everything. Real Baptist pastor Rob Morgan told a story years ago of an art collector. He was a very wealthy man. He traveled the world, and he collected fine art. He enjoyed collecting art with his son, who would make many of the trips with him and help him select the pieces that they would add to their collection, and their home was filled with these masterpieces, these priceless works of art. As the young son got older, a war broke out. And the young son answered the call to serve his country in battle. And the art collecting father waited and hoped and prayed that his son would come home. And one day the fateful news came that his son had been lost in the war. Years passed and he struggled with his grief. One day there was a knock at the door, and the young man that was there at the door introduced himself as a war buddy of his son. And he told the father stories of his son's heroics and how he had died valiantly giving his life to save the lives of his friends. And he said, your son talked of you often. And he told us that you loved art and you collected art. He said, I'm not much of an artist, but I draw portraits. And I drew a portrait of your son, and I'd like to give it to you as a gift. The father took that portrait that had been sketched by his son's friend, and he had it framed. Moved masterpieces off of the wall so he could hang it in a prominent place. The day came that the art collector passed away, and the art world was abuzz that this estate was going to be auctioned off. So many fine pieces of art would be auctioned off. So many masterpieces would be available. People came from around the world to this estate auction. And the first piece of art that was lifted up to be auctioned off was that sketch done by the war buddy. The man said, this is our first piece to auction off. Who'll give me $100? Who'll give me $100? Nobody wanted to make a bid. The man said, this is our first piece. We must auction it off first. Who'll give me $100? Finally, some people in the crowd said, listen, none of us are interested in this piece. We'd like to move on to the more famous masterpieces. And the auctioneer said, no, I'm sorry, we cannot move forward until we've auctioned off this first piece. Who'll give me $50? Who'll give me $50? There was a neighbor who had come really just more out of interest, being nosy maybe. And he said, well, I knew the boy. I'd like to have the picture up. I've got $40. I'll pay $40. The auctioneer said, $40, going once, going twice, sold. He said, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our auction. People stood up in an uproar. What do you mean that concludes the auction? We're here to buy these masterpieces. He said, according to the will and testament, whoever purchases the son gets it all. The message of the gospel is that whoever welcomes the Son gets it all. That's what we offer. That's what we're about. That's what moves people from brokenness to restoration. That's what makes the difference, is Christ in our lives. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.